The evening the Hartwell dinner party first fell upon Nora Vane's shoulders. The snow had not yet come, but the cold had, pressing itself against every window of Hartwell Park like a creditor who had run out of patience. She stood at the far end of the long gallery where the guests were assembling, a tray of sherry balanced in her hands, wearing the gray dress they had given her. It was a housemaid's dress, plain as a Wednesday, cut for a woman of larger frame who had left service some years ago and donated the garment to the household stores. The hem required lifting with 2 fingers on either side to navigate the stairs, and the collar sat an inch too wide at the neck, exposing the curve of her collarbone to the candlelight in a way that the dress had clearly not intended, and that Nora could do nothing about. She wore no jewelry. There was no jewelry left to wear. She was not a housemaid. She had been, until 14 months ago, the youngest daughter of Mr. Towle, Arthur Vane of Wiltshire, a gentleman of modest but respectable income, and her name had appeared twice in the Wiltshire Gazette, alongside accounts of small society assemblies. Mr. Dandom Place. Arthur Vane had died in debt, a circumstance his family had not known about until the solicitor arrived, and the debts had been considerable, and the house had been let, and Nora had been 17 years old, with a good education, 3 gowns that still fit, and no prospects of any kind that did not require her to be useful. Her cousin Dorothea had offered her a place at Hartwell Park. That was how it had been described. A place. What the place turned out to be was this: carrying sherry on a tray in a dress that belonged to someone else, past guests, who glanced at her, the way one glances at furniture, in a house presided over by Dorothea's mother-in-law, Lady Constance Hartwell, who had decided within the first week of Nora's arrival what she was, and had not revised the assessment since. The assessment was a poor relation, performing the function of a servant, and welcome to neither category fully. Lady Constance stood near the fireplace in her customary position, diamonds catching every nearby candle. She wore black with such authority that it read as luxury rather than mourning. Her son Hartwell was somewhere in the county, and his wife Dorothea stood among the guests with the expression of a woman who was managing something complicated and preferred not to be asked about it. The remaining guests were the sort that a provincial dinner party assembles in late autumn. The Alderton family from the neighboring estate, the vicar, a solicitor named Finch, who handled much of the local business, and the Alderton family's house guest, who had arrived from London 3 days prior and had already caused a particular quality of attention to pass through every drawing-room within 7 miles. That was Baron Ashcroft of Marstone. He was tall in the specific way that becomes noticeable only when he stood still, which he did now near the gallery's east windows, holding a glass he had not yet touched, his back to the room. He appeared to be looking at the grounds, though there was nothing to see in the dark, beyond his own reflection in the glass. He had dark hair that had not been attended to with any particular vanity, and a jaw that suggested he had not slept especially well the previous night, and a posture that communicated, quietly, but without apology, that he was in the habit of being the most important person in any room he entered and found the distinction primarily inconvenient. Nora moved along the far wall toward the Alderton group, offering sherry. She did not look at the Baron. She was practiced at being invisible, and the tray helped. "Good heavens," said Mrs. Seven. Alderton. Not to Nora, but about her. In that particular Regency idiom of speaking of a person as though they were a piece of furniture. Is that the cousin? The question was directed at Lady Constance, who had drifted nearer. "Miss Vane," Lady Constance said with the precision of a woman placing a pin, "has been kind enough to assist us this evening. Our housemaid's sister has taken ill." She smiled toward Nora without including her. "We are grateful for her adaptability." Mrs. Alderton made the sound of a woman who has been given more information than she strictly required. Nora held the tray level. She did not look up. The sherry caught the candlelight. From the east window, something changed. She felt it before she saw it, the way one feels a door open somewhere in a house and registers the alteration in air pressure before hearing the sound of it. She looked up because her body looked up before her mind could instruct it otherwise. And Baron Ashcroft had turned from the window. He was looking directly at her, not at the tray, at her face. She looked away immediately, but the impression remained, specific and unaccountable. He had been watching her since she entered the room, and she had not known it, and the watching had held nothing of the patronizing quality she was accustomed to. It had held something else entirely, something she could not presently name. If you have ever stood in a room where the air is about to change and felt the stillness that precedes it, stay close. This story belongs to that stillness. The dinner was announced before she could think further on it. She retired to the kitchen passage while the guests filed into the dining room, and she told herself, as she had told herself many times, that she was being fanciful, that gentlemen looked at faces when there were faces to look at, and that a baron from London who happened to glance across a candle-lit gallery had not singled her out, for any particular reason. She told herself this with some conviction. She did not entirely believe it. The dining room at Hartwell Park seated 30 at full complement and looked, when laid for a dinner party, as though it had been decorated to make the point that some people lived like this all the time, and would you please note the difference. The candelabra were silver, the cloth was Irish linen. The epergne at the center held fruit that had been brought at considerable expense from a London market, because the local season did not run to pineapple. Nora served the first course from the left, as instructed, moving between the seated guests with a kind of practiced invisibility she had perfected over the past 14 months. She had learned to look at the surface of the table slightly above the nearest plate, which gave the impression of attentiveness without inviting eye contact. She had learned to move without the hem of the gray dress catching on chair legs. She had learned to be useful and not to be noticed, because the second quality was as important as the first in a household, where noticing her too directly seemed to cause Lady Constance a vague but visible displeasure. Lady Constance sat at the head of the table. Baron Ashcroft had been placed at her right, which was the seat of honor, and which meant that from her position of service along the wall, Nora faced him directly at intervals. She tried not to face him directly. He did not appear to be trying the same. The dinner conversation moved through its expected channels: the weather, the state of the roads, some business in Parliament that the solicitor Finch had opinions about, Mrs. Nan D.S., Alderton's eldest daughter, who had recently become engaged to a clergyman with good prospects, and about whom the table was expected to feel a carefully calibrated warmth. Nora moved along the wall and listened with the portion of her attention she could spare, because she had found that overhearing things was one of the few pleasures available to people in her current position, and she was not above taking what pleasure was available. It was midway through the second course that the incident with the wine occurred. She was refilling Lady Constance's glass when young Mr. Jebblers, Alderton, 19 years old, and somewhat in love with his own elbow, reached past her without warning to gesture at the decanter, and the sleeve of his coat caught the neck of the bottle she was holding, and she startled, and a thin thread of claret came down the sleeve of the gray dress. It was not a catastrophe. It was a thin thread. It would wash. But Mr. Binns, Alderton said, "Oh, bother," and immediately returned to his conversation, which communicated with perfect clarity that the bother had not been his. And Lady Constance looked at the sleeve, and then at Nora, with an expression that suggested the stain was a moral failing of some individual specificity. "The gray," Lady Constance said to no one in particular, "does not show to advantage." In any case, Nora set down the decanter. She smoothed the stained sleeve with 2 fingers. "I am sorry," she said to the table, meaning the interruption rather than any fault she had committed, and turned to retrieve a cloth from the sideboard. She became aware, as she crossed to the sideboard, that the table's conversation had resumed, and covered the moment entirely. She became aware also, a breath later, that Baron Ashcroft had not resumed his conversation. She felt this rather than saw it. She kept her back to the table. When she returned to her position at the wall, she looked at the middle distance. She did not look at the Baron. His glass, she noticed at the edge of her vision, was still untouched. The dinner concluded. The gentlemen remained for port, and the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room where the fire was high and the conversation turned, with the particular momentum of a river seeking its level, to the subject of Baron Ashcroft of Merestone. He was wealthy, this much was established. He had come into the barony at 26 when his father died, and he was now 33, and he had not married, which was a circumstance the neighborhood found simultaneously interesting and slightly suspicious. He had an estate in Northamptonshire, and another property in Devon, and he had served briefly on some commission in the north that had to do with agricultural reform, which the vicar found admirable, and Mrs. Proper Alderton found politically obscure. Nora was not in the drawing-room for this conversation. She was in the kitchen passage, helping the cook restore the crockery, wearing the gray dress with the wine on the sleeve, and she could hear through the partially open door the low cadence of women assessing a man they found interesting. And she found, to her own mild surprise, that she was listening. "Dorothea," said Mrs. Alderton, "you must know something of his intentions." Dorothea, who was Nora's cousin by marriage, said something careful and non-committal that Nora could not fully hear. "What one hears," said Lady Constance, in the tone she used for information she had personally verified through superior channels, "is that he is looking for a match this season. His mother's family have made the point rather directly. He requires someone with connections." A pause. "He has been looking at your cousin," said Mrs. Alderton. Another pause. "Nora," said Dorothea. "The girl in the gray dress," Mrs. Alderton confirmed. "At the window quite openly." "I noticed it. I think," said Lady Constance, "that Miss Vane may have been standing near something else that interested him. A poor relation in a housemaid's dress is hardly a suitable object of a baron's attention. He is only 27. A small sound of adjusting her position, or 33. One of those. Nora pressed her back against the passage wall. The cold from the stone came through the dress. She was not surprised by this. She had heard Lady Constance's assessment of her suitability in various formulations over 14 months, and she had learned to absorb them the way one absorbs cold. It went through her now without changing anything essential. What stayed with her instead was the small specific fact that he had been looking at her from the window. Mrs. Alderton had noticed it. She had not imagined it. She told herself this did not matter and went back to the crockery. The following morning produced frost, and with it, Baron Ashcroft. He arrived at Hartwell Park at 10 o'clock on horseback, which was unusual, having apparently told the Aldertons that he wished to look at the property's lower field, which bordered their own and about which there had been some old dispute over a drainage ditch that Nora understood only vaguely. Lady Constance received him in the morning room with Dorothea in attendance, and Nora, who had been in the process of carrying a basket of mending from one wing of the house to the other, found herself walking directly into his path, in the south corridor. She stopped. He stopped. The corridor was not wide. The distance between them was approximately 6 feet, which was the length of a dining table, and not especially far. He looked at her with the same quality of attention he had held last night at the gallery window, undiluted by time or reconsideration. It was not the look of a man who had catalogued her and placed her in a category. It was the look of a man who had not yet decided what category applied, and who seemed in no particular hurry to decide. She became aware of the basket in her hands, the gray dress, the state of her hair, which she had arranged efficiently that morning, because efficiency was all that was required of it. "Miss Vane," he said. She had not told him her name. She had not spoken to him once. "My lord," she said, and stepped to one side to let him pass. He did not pass. He stood for a breath, and she felt the moment with her skin before she understood it with her mind. The specific quality of a man choosing to speak when courtesy would have permitted silence. "The dress," he said. "Was it yours?" She looked at him. She had not intended to. "I beg your pardon, last evening. The gray. It did not fit you." It was not a question. It was not quite an observation of the conventional kind. It was something more deliberate than that, and plainer, and she could not immediately determine what to do with its plainness. "It was provided," she said after a moment. "By the household." "Yes." He looked at her for another moment, then at something past her shoulder in the middle distance, and something in his face shifted very slightly, in a way she could not read, but that made the corridor feel several degrees warmer than it had been. "I see," he said. He walked past her then toward the morning room. She stood in the corridor after he had gone, the basket still in her hands, and she thought about the specific way he had said, "I see," as though what he saw was not precisely the mending basket, or the ill-fitting dress, or the cold stone corridor, but something beneath all of it, something she had stopped expecting anyone to notice. She told herself to stop thinking about it. She was not very successful. The visit to the lower field lasted the morning, and reconvened, at Lady Constance's invitation, to a luncheon. Nora was not present at luncheon. She ate in the kitchen, with the cook, and one of the footmen, as she had done every day for 14 months, and she listened to the cook describe the particular inadequacy of the kitchen garden in winter, and she thought about drainage ditches, and whether they had anything to do with her. They did not. She knew this. She was not a person to whom drainage disputes pertained. She ate her bread, and told herself so. In the days that followed, Baron Ashcroft came 3 more times to Hartwell Park. The first occasion was the drainage business, which appeared to be genuine. The second was a morning call that lasted the socially permissible 40 minutes, and was attended by Lady Constance Dorothea, the Alderton daughters, and notably, the daughter of a baronet from the next parish who had been invited specifically for this purpose, and who was everything Nora was not in terms of connections, fortune, and the ability to wear her own clothing. Nora glimpsed this second visit from the landing as she was carrying linens upstairs. She did not slow her pace. The third visit was in the afternoon. The household was largely empty of its principal members, who had gone in the carriage to call upon a family 2 miles distant. Nora was in the library, returning a set of books to their shelves. She had taken the liberty of borrowing them, one at a time, in the evenings, returning each before morning. She did not think anyone had noticed. She heard the door before she heard him. The library was at the end of the east corridor, somewhat removed from the principal rooms, and visitors did not generally come here unless they specifically intended to. She turned from the shelf, a volume of Cowper still in her hands. Baron Ashcroft stood in the doorway. He took in the room. He took in the book. He took in her. "The family has gone out," she said, because it seemed the necessary piece of information. "I know," he said. "The housekeeper told me." He came into the library and closed the door behind him, which was improper, though the degree of impropriety was somewhat moderated by the fact of the open window at the far end and the general domesticity of the setting. He walked to the nearest shelf and looked at the spines the way people look at books when they are actually thinking about something else. "You have been reading," he said. "I have been returning," she said carefully. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the smallest thing, barely a change, but it altered his face entirely, and she felt it across the space between them, as though it had a temperature. "You are in the habit of it," he said, Cowper. "He is honest," she said. "He says what he means. Most people do not consider that a literary virtue. Most people do not have to guess what is meant to them all day," she said, and then stopped, because that was more than she had intended to say, and she could not quite see where it had come from. He turned from the shelf to look at her directly. She held Cowper and did not look away, because looking away now would be worse than whatever this was. "No," he said quietly. "I do not suppose they do." He stayed for perhaps 20 minutes. They talked about Cowper and then about the estate's library more generally, which he said was good, and she agreed. And it was the most natural conversation she had conducted in 14 months, which was its own particular species of grief. He did not address her situation directly. He did not patronize her. He asked her opinion of 3 separate books and listened to her answers with the focused attention of a man who intended to remember them. When he left, he said, "Good afternoon, Miss Vane," in a voice that landed differently than the same words would have from anyone else. She stood in the library for some time after. "Here is what you should know about Thomas Ashcroft, 6th Baron of Mirestone, before you decide what kind of man he is. He had been married once at 24, to a woman named Clara, who had been quick-minded and warm, and who had died in childbed at 25, along with the child on a night in February that he had been 2 hours' ride away and had not arrived in time. For Stichius, he had returned to the bedchamber and found nothing that required him, and the surgeon had explained what had happened in terms that were clear and humane, and Thomas had listened to all of it, and then had been very quiet for a period of approximately 2 years, during which he had managed his estates with thoroughness, and spoken at length to almost no one. His mother's family had begun, with increasing directness, to suggest that the barony required an heir, that Clara had been gone 3 years now, and that it was both natural and advisable for him to remarry. He had acknowledged this. He had understood it. He had made the journey to Northamptonshire and then to London, and then on the recommendation of an old friend to the Alderton family, in this county, partly for the drainage business, and partly because the friend had said in the letter that a change of air might be useful. The friend had not been wrong. He had not expected the library. He had not expected the too wide collar on the ill-fitting dress, and the way she had carried herself inside it as though it were armor she had chosen, rather than clothing she had been given. He had not expected the quality of her attention, which was the attention of someone who had learned to read rooms the way a surveyor reads land, carefully and for practical information, with none of the performance that women in her situation were generally expected to produce. He had not expected to find himself thinking about her at 6 o'clock in the morning, while riding the perimeter of his friend Alderton's field. He was thinking about it now, which was its own kind of information. He had learned, after Clara, that his own feelings were not always reliable messengers. He had grown cautious with them. He did not move quickly toward things that felt true, because he had found that what felt true, and what was true, sometimes required more distance between them to be distinguished. He gave himself another week. He rode past Hartwell Park twice during that week, which could be explained by the drainage survey. He was not certain he explained it that way to himself. Lady Constance noticed the riding past. She said nothing about it directly, but she rearranged 2 luncheons and a morning call to ensure that Miss Alderton and the baronet's daughter were present during hours when the baron might call, and she said to Dorothea, in a voice pitched to carry to the kitchen passage where Nora happened to be passing, "Of course a man in Lord Ashcroft's position is looking at his options, and there are options here worth looking at. Poor Nora, at least, need not be added to anyone's calculations. She has nothing to recommend her." Nora heard this. She had heard this formulation in various iterations over 14 months. This one was more specific, because it was aimed, and she had understood for 3 days now what it was aimed at, and so it landed with a slightly different weight than usual. She set down the basket she was carrying, and stood in the passage for a moment. She was not angry. She was something quieter than angry. The thing that lives on the other side of anger when anger has burned through, and what remains is just the plain shape of a fact. She was nobody's calculation, and that would remain true whether or not she was reminded of it. She picked up the basket and went on. The Hardwell Christmas party was scheduled for the 15th of December, which was a Thursday. It was not a ball. Lady Constance did not hold balls which she considered excessive, but she held a dinner party with 26 covers, dancing afterward in the gallery, and a supper at midnight, which achieved the same social weight and required from Nora the same gray dress and the same tray, because the household had expanded by 1 additional footman for the evening, but had not extended to the provision of clothing for its poor relations. She wore the gray dress. She carried the tray. The gallery was transformed by the season. Evergreen boughs along the mantelpiece. Candles doubled in every holder, the smell of bayberry and something warm from the kitchen. It was beautiful in the specific way that someone else's beautiful is beautiful, which is to say entirely and without offering any of itself. Nora moved through it, noting without lingering, taking pleasure in the candles because the candles did not belong to anyone. The guests arrived over the course of an hour. The Alderton family, the vicar, the solicitor, Finch, several families she did not know well. The baronet's family, with the daughter, and at the last, in a dark coat, and with the expression of a man who had decided some time earlier what he intended to do this evening, and was simply waiting to do it, Baron Ashcroft. He found her with his eyes immediately. She saw him do it from across the gallery, and she looked away first, though it cost her something to do so. The evening began. She served. She moved. She held the tray level. Lady Constance, midway through the reception, and in conversation with Mrs. Plath, Alderton said something in a carrying tone about the advantages of good breeding and the difficulty of educating certain sensibilities into people who had simply not been formed by the appropriate circumstances. The baronet's daughter was mentioned warmly. Miss Vane was not mentioned by name, but the architecture of what was said made clear which absence was being gestured at. Nora was 3 feet away, refilling a glass. She did not set down the decanter. One does what one can, Lady Constance concluded, for those in reduced circumstances, though it is a kindness they do not always fully appreciate. Nora set down the decanter. She turned to find Baron Ashcroft standing behind her. 2 feet away in the particular stillness he had that was not passivity, but its opposite. He had heard it. She could see that he had. His face had not changed, but there was something in the line of his jaw that had gone several degrees past. Still, their eyes met for a moment. She looked away first. Again, she did not know what she would have done if she had not. She went toward the sideboard, but she heard him speak behind her, something quiet to the nearest footman. And then the conversation in the room shifted in the indefinable way that conversations shift when someone important has done something that people cannot quite account for. She did not look. The dinner was announced. She served. She moved. The meal progressed through its courses with the ceremony that Lady Constance required of it, and the conversation covered the expected subjects with the expected warmth, and Nora stood at her station and thought about nothing in particular very carefully. She noticed toward the middle of the meal that Baron Ashcroft was not eating with his characteristic economy of motion. He was eating, and he was speaking when spoken to, and he was entirely present and correct. There was something in the quality of his stillness that had changed since the gallery, and she could feel it from across the table the way one feels a change in weather before the sky has done anything visible to announce it. She noticed also that he looked at her twice. Not at the tray, not at the table, not at anything else, at her face. The third time she looked back. She did not mean to. She looked back before she could choose not to, and he was already looking at her, and neither of them looked away immediately. And the candlelight did what candlelight does in a room full of people, which is to make everything look slightly more significant than it otherwise would. She looked away first. She was making a habit of it. After the dinner, the dancing. She was not dancing. She was standing near the edge of the gallery with the tray, watching the patterns form and dissolve, and she was thinking about how beautiful it was, and how far from her, and she was not, she told herself firmly, thinking about anything else. Miss Vane. His voice was low. He had come to stand beside her at the gallery's edge, which was improper only in the way that many things were improper when considered carefully, and she was too surprised to move away before the moment of moving away had passed. "My lord," she said. He stood beside her. He was looking at the dancing. She looked at the dancing also. "Do you dance?" he said. "Not this evening." "That is not what I asked." She looked at him. He was still looking at the dancers. His profile in the candlelight had that quality she had noticed in the library. The quality of a man who is not performing anything but simply being what he is. "I have danced," she said. "In another life. Not so long ago," he said. "Long enough." A pause. Someone laughed near the fireplace. The music continued. "I knew your father's name," he said. "Arthur Vane of Wiltshire. He corresponded with my father about a bill in the county assembly some years ago." He wrote clearly. She felt this statement arrive in her chest and take up more space than seemed warranted by its size. It was not sympathy. It was something more precise than sympathy. It was recognition of a specific thing that had existed before her circumstances had reduced her. A confirmation that Arthur Vane had been a man whose correspondence was worth noting. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. "Thank you," she said when she could. He nodded once, the way he did when he had said what he meant and required nothing further. They stood in silence for another minute. The music played. The dancers turned. "The grey dress," he said at last. "My lord, I intend to speak to Lady Constance tomorrow morning," he said. "About several things." He turned to look at her then, directly, and without the distance that the evening had maintained. "I wanted you to know that first." She looked at him. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. "I do not understand what you mean," she said. Though she thought with a clarity that alarmed her, that she did understand, that she had understood it in the library, and possibly in the corridor, and possibly at the east window of the gallery on the first evening when he had looked at her face. "I think you do," he said quietly. "But I will explain it in the morning." He stepped back, correctly, and rejoined the nearest group of guests, and Nora stood at the edge of the gallery with the tray in her hands and the music in her ears, and tried to understand what had just happened to the shape of the world. She did not succeed at understanding it that evening. She went to bed in her small room at the end of the west corridor and lay awake for a considerable time, and she thought about a man who had said, "I see," in a corridor and had meant it. She thought about what it felt like to be seen. She told herself, as she had told herself throughout, that she was being fanciful, that a baron from London was not going to alter his arrangements for a woman in a grey housemaid's dress. That she had spent 14 months in circumstances that had made her too susceptible to small kindnesses, and that she was misreading something that was simply courtesy. She almost convinced herself. The morning came with snow. The first of the season, falling in the particular soft silence that snow makes when it has decided to mean something, settling on the grounds of Hartwell Park with a patience that was its own kind of statement. Nora was in the kitchen corridor at 8:30, wrapping her hands around a cup of tea, when she heard Lady Constance's voice from the morning room at a pitch, and register it did not ordinarily reach. She did not go closer. She stayed in the corridor and listened to the indistinct sound of it, a voice that had encountered something it had not prepared for, and was recalibrating in real time. The morning room door opened. Dorothea came out first, with an expression Nora had never seen on her cousin's face, which was something between astonishment and a species of relief that had been penned in a very long time. "Nora," said Dorothea, and stopped. "What has happened?" Nora said. Dorothea looked at her for a moment. "He came this morning," she said, "before 9 o'clock. He was very direct." A pause. "He asked about your situation, your father's debts. He asked how it had come about that you were serving at dinner." Another pause. Longer. Lady Constance explained it, and he listened to all of it. And then he said that he thought the explanation was inadequate. Nora set down the cup. "He said," Dorothea continued carefully, "that he wished to speak to you, and that before he did, he wanted Lady Constance to understand that Miss Vane's prospects were no longer a matter for Lady Constance's household to arrange, and that if Lady Constance had any further explanation to offer for the grey dress, he was prepared to listen to it, but not to be convinced by it. The corridor was cold. The snow was falling outside the kitchen window. "He said that," Nora said. "He said that," Dorothea confirmed, "in approximately those words. I was present." The morning room door opened again, and Baron Ashcroft came into the corridor. He looked at Dorothea and then at Nora, and Dorothea, demonstrating a social instinct that Nora had not previously known she possessed, went back into the morning room and closed the door. They stood in the kitchen corridor. The snow outside, the cup of tea still warm on the shelf. Behind her, he looked at her in the way he looked at things he was deciding to be honest about. "I am aware," he said, "that this is abrupt. You may tell me so." "It is somewhat abrupt," she agreed. "I have been thinking since the gallery," he said the first evening. "I am not as a rule impulsive. I have been called many things, but impulsive has not generally been among them." He paused. "Clara, my wife who died, used to say that I moved at geological pace." She looked at him. She had not expected the name, the directness of it, the way he said it, without flinching. "3 years ago," he said. I mention it so that you understand that what I am about to say has not come from any incapacity to be serious about what I am saying. I understand that, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Outside the window, the snow continued its patient work. I find that I do not wish to leave this county, he said, without having asked you something. And I find that I am most usefully honest when I say plainly what I mean rather than constructing a context around it. A pause. So, I am asking, not because you are in reduced circumstances, not because I pity you, and not because I require an heir so urgently that any acceptable candidate will serve. I'm asking because you are the most interesting person I've encountered in 3 years, and because the gray dress made me angry on your behalf, and because you know Cowper and think honesty is a literary virtue, which I happen to agree with. Nora stood in the kitchen corridor and felt the shape of the world change completely, quietly, the way that large things change when they have been building toward their alteration for long enough. You are asking, she said. I am asking, she looked at him. She looked at the line of his face and the quality of his attention, and the way he stood in the kitchen corridor, as though the kitchen corridor were as correct a place to say important things as any ballroom. The drainage ditch, she said. Was it real? The corner of his mouth moved again, the small thing. Entirely real. I have opinions about drainage ditches. All right, she said. He waited. Yes, she said. I mean to say yes. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face opened slightly, the way a window opens when someone decides the room has been closed long enough. Good, he said. Then, because he was a man who said what he meant, I am glad. What followed was both more and less complicated than it sounds. Lady Constance received the news with a composed expression that cost her a visible effort to maintain, and she sat with that effort for the remainder of the day. And by evening she had arranged her understanding of events into a version in which she had always thought well of Nora, and had been managing her situation with the household's best intentions. Nora did not contradict this version. She had no interest in Lady Constance's difficulty. She had her own things to attend to. Dorothea cried, briefly, in the passage outside the morning room, and then went to find her husband, who had returned from his journey, and listened to the account with the expression of a man who had suspected something of this nature was coming, but had not known how to prevent it, and was now relieved he had not tried. The solicitor Finch arrived the following week, and conducted himself with the efficiency of a man who understood that the relevant parties wished to proceed promptly, and the documents were prepared and the details were arranged, and the matter was concluded with a legal specificity that left no space for reconsideration or complication. The gray dress was returned to the household stores. Nora was not there to witness it. She was in the library with Thomas, who was in the habit, she discovered, of spending the morning in libraries when he had access to them, and who had opinions about agricultural poetry that she found both informed and slightly more confident than the evidence strictly warranted, and she said so. And he said that one of them was wrong about Cowper, and he did not believe it was him. You are competitive, she said. About poetry, he said. Not generally. That seems like an unusual place to draw the line. I have unusual lines, he said, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it did. And she felt it as she had always felt it, which was as a warmth from several feet away, specific and unaccountable, and entirely reliable. She had not expected this. She had not expected that reliability would turn out to be one of the things she wanted most. The specific knowledge that a person would mean what they said, and say what they meant, and come back to the library in the morning because they said they would. She had gone 14 months without it. It had cost her more than she had acknowledged at the time she acknowledged it now. They were married, in January, at the church in the village, on a day that was cold and clear, with frost on the grass, and light that had the quality of light, in January, which is to say that it was thin and very clean, and made everything it touched look specific and true. Nora wore a gown of ivory wool, with a Spencer jacket of deep blue, which had been made for her in the space of 10 days by a dressmaker in the nearest town who had taken some pride in the commission. It fit her. She had not worn clothing that fit her in 14 months. The ceremony was attended by the Aldertons, The solicitor Finch, Dorothea and her husband, the vicar, of course, and a small number of Thomas's people who had traveled from Northamptonshire, and who received her with a directness she appreciated. Lady Constance attended. She sat in the second pew and wore a face of determined composure, and she said nothing that was not correct, and that was sufficient. Afterward, at Hartwell Park, where the wedding breakfast was held at Dorothea's insistence, Nora stood near the fire in the drawing-room and held a cup of tea that was the right temperature, and watched the snow that had resumed falling outside the window. And she thought about the kitchen corridor and the first evening, and the east window, where a man had turned from his own reflection to look at her. Thomas came to stand beside her. He did not have a glass. He was looking at the snow. "We leave tomorrow," he said. "I know." A pause. "Northamptonshire." "I have been told it is very cold in Northamptonshire," she said. "It is extremely cold," he said. "I have not deceived you about this." "No," she said. "You have not deceived me about anything." He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. They were standing in a drawing-room at a wedding breakfast, surrounded by people who had, on balance, decided to be glad for them. And it was January, and the snow was falling, and she had on a dress that fit her, and she was going to Northamptonshire tomorrow. She thought about Arthur Vane of Wiltshire, who had written clearly, and whose correspondence had been worth noting. She thought about him looking at her from wherever the dead look from, and she hoped that what he saw was that his daughter had not been reduced to anything permanently, that she had kept the essential thing intact, and someone had eventually recognized it. She thought that he would have liked Thomas Ashcroft. She thought he would have appreciated the directness. Thomas took her hand. He had never held her hand before. He held it now briefly in the drawing-room, with full visibility to the assembled guests, who were choosing not to make a point of it, and she felt the warmth of it through her glove and did not pull away. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the snow. "Yes," she said. They left the following morning in the carriage north toward Northamptonshire as the fields lay white and the roads were clear enough, and Nora had a small box of books beside her that Thomas had insisted on carrying himself, and inside the lid of the box, tucked into the front pages of the Cowper, was a letter in her father's handwriting that had been the one thing she had kept all the way through, folded and slightly worn at the creases, which she had read so many times that she no longer needed to unfold it. She did not unfold it now. She did not need to. The carriage moved north. The snow was still, and the light was clean, and the road went on. If this story moved you, stay a little longer. Leave a word in the comment below. Not from me, but because Nora would have written clearly, and her father's daughter deserves the last word. The road went on, and she was in it, and she was known.